At midnight on April 29, 1945, Adolf Hitler sat down with his personal secretary and dictated what would become his last will. Newly declassified Soviet files and modern forensic re-examinations in the 2010-2020 have reopened key questions about the people and events named in that document. Some did not remain loyal. Some left behind traces, while others disappeared entirely in the confusion. In this film, we'll show three things new evidence forces you to re-evaluate: what Hitler breathed, what he took, and what his inner circle actually did. And it begins with the air surrounding them. The bunker as a death trap. It wasn't just the artillery overhead or the Soviet tanks pushing deeper into Berlin that made conditions inside the Führerbunker unbearable. A quieter and inescapable danger came from the very air the occupants were breathing. Built beneath the Reich Chancellery to endure bombardment, the structure's defenses against explosions were solid. But by the last week of April 1945, its critical systems were faltering. Survivor testimony and later engineering analyses, supported by archival reports, confirmed that the ventilation was badly compromised by bomb damage. The diesel generators running below filled passageways with fumes, while smoke from burning debris above filtered downward through damaged ducts. Accounts long dismissed as exaggerations, complaints about the stench, headaches, and sleeplessness matched what we now know about those failing systems. By April 29th, conditions were worsening quickly. Contemporary and later medical assessments, combined with survivors' recollections, strongly suggest that air quality had degraded enough to affect cognition. Symptoms described included stinging eyes, dizziness, nausea, and a disorienting mental haze. Those confined to the underground spaces often assumed their suffering came from exhaustion or nerves, but the environment was clearly amplifying the strain. Even in what was designed as the most secure shelter in Berlin, the atmosphere itself was making people unwell. The atmosphere is important to picture, since it frames what actually unfolded during those final hours. The bunker was overcrowded. Soldiers, aides, secretaries, and officials pressed into narrow spaces. The stale air carried the smell of diesel, sweat, and smoke. Improvised lighting often flickered, powered by overworked generators that could not reliably handle the demand. The deeper a person went, the heavier the atmosphere became. Claustrophobia mixed with fatigue, and silence was often broken by coughing or muttered complaints. This supposed fortress against destruction was instead sealing its residents into a slow decline. The physical effects were subtle but cumulative. Witnesses later described sluggishness, as if a fog dulled their focus even when assignments demanded precision. Messages were mistyped, simple questions forgotten, and judgment clouded. Few dared to voice the true extent of their distress, anxious that suggestions of weakness could be taken for disloyalty. Later diaries referenced aching heads, nausea after eating, and joints that throbbed despite food rations remaining constant. Some remembered fainting without warning. The mechanics of the problem were hidden. Engineers who might have explained the crisis were gone, leaving people to endure without knowing they were breathing a toxic blend every hour of the day. For Hitler, this was not simply discomfort. His health was already weakened by years of medication and recent treatments that included amphetamines and eye drops, all documented by witnesses and later forensic discussion. Combined with meager oxygen, diesel fumes, and rising stress, the result may have deepened his instability. His body was showing strain. Witnesses noted his slower movements and reliance on furniture for support. His thinking, too, grew more erratic, as paranoia escalated faster than the military developments alone might explain. Modern scholars stress that the bunker's air acted as one more accelerant, pushing an unwell man into a distorted mental state. This re-evaluation matters because survivor testimony long underplayed the role of air quality. Many remembered bombardment, fear, or betrayal, but not the subtler influence of the sealed space itself. Yet medical knowledge today makes plain that inhaling emissions from generators in poor ventilation can sap energy, worsen mood, and impair decision-making. Tie this to eyewitness reports of Hitler speaking of betrayal by those right beside him, and one sees how the poisoned atmosphere could have sharpened paranoia while blunting rational thought. That perspective reshapes how we think about conversations in those hours. Anger directed at secretaries, abrupt accusations against loyal aides, and furious critiques of military staff may not have come solely from desperation about the collapsing front. They can be read as outbursts reinforced by an environment quietly reducing his ability to reason clearly. Carbon monoxide and fumes cannot be measured after the fact, but symptoms align with what such exposure creates. It was not just ideology and drugs shaping his end, but the polluted air that trapped him inside his supposed safe haven. The structure itself played a cruel role in this transformation. The bunker had been celebrated for its strength: several meters of concrete, interlocking chambers, blast doors. But that same isolation meant there were no windows, no sunlight, no possibility of fresh air once ventilation faltered. The more hours spent inside, the more the atmosphere thickened. The claustrophobic mix hit younger staff hardest. Secretaries in their 20s remembered fainting at their work or vomiting in corners, yet staying silent out of fear. Military officers pushed through their duties, storing up migraines and exhaustion that only amplified mistakes. These technical factors shift the narrative. The final command post of the Third Reich was not the calm center from which Hitler directed events until the last moment. It was a place that eroded everyone's strength and composure. The sense of airlessness fed anxiety. Anxiety, in turn, deepened the sense of suffocation, and this cycle magnified the collapse of morale. What unfolded in those last nights was not only ideological frenzy, but a physical environment assaulting its inhabitants with every breath. The image that emerges is of a space that became its own form of entrapment. The walls kept bombs at bay, but they also slowly poisoned the people within. Movement slowed, tempers flared, thoughts fogged. A dictator's collapse was sped along by the invisible assault of his surroundings, which betrayed him as surely as any military reversal outside. And while the choking atmosphere dominated those days, not every story inside the bunker was defined by physical decline alone. Amid the suffocation and confusion, some were making deliberate choices about how they wanted to be remembered. Eva Braun's final routine. For Eva Braun, the final hours did not mean fading into the background. She was not simply an ornament in Hitler's shadow. Recently published personal accounts and archival letters in Germany, alongside testimony from witnesses such as Traudl Jung, have prompted historians to reconsider her role. These sources suggest that Braun engaged directly with her surroundings, making choices about clothing, personal belongings, and her appearance. In those cramped rooms, as Soviet forces closed in, she presented herself with deliberation rather than passivity. Testimony recalls her sorting through clothes, asking others to help, and directing which garments should be kept and which should be destroyed. Items once associated with her life beside Hitler, dresses, shoes, photographs, were no longer treated as tokens of status. They had become dangerous reminders, objects that could be seized and wielded as propaganda. Witnesses remembered that Braun took care to see them disposed of, either burned or buried, so they would not fall into Soviet hands. These choices were not casual. They reveal a woman calculating how much of her personal world could be eliminated before it was turned against her memory. The act of deciding what to erase went hand in hand with how she prepared herself to be seen. Jung and other attendants later remembered that Braun asked for a dress she had set aside, one she wished to wear on her last day. To them, this seemed striking, not because of vanity, but because it indicated she wanted to determine her appearance even in death. In surrounding testimony, small details linger: a collar straightened, hair arranged, manner calm. Historians analyzing these recollections emphasize the importance of agency. She was not aimless or indifferent. She made conscious choices, down to selecting which dress would frame her final image. Accounts also describe the atmosphere she cultivated. Others in the bunker were unsteady, exhausted, and unsettled by the failing systems and constant artillery fire. Braun, by contrast, displayed a steady composure. Secretaries and aides remembered that she remained calm when speaking to them, encouraging dignity in the face of destruction. Her behavior was deliberate, restrained posture, even tone, outward steadiness. Witnesses described it as unsettling precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the breakdown happening around her. When Hitler descended into rants about betrayal, or when senior officials argued over fragments of military news, Braun's behavior seemed measured, even rehearsed. Rather than interpreting this as mere detachment, historians point toward the way she asserted control over her final hours. While she had no influence on the war outside, she retained influence over how she would be remembered. Personal notes and lingering testimony include references to her concern with impression and appearance in history. In the middle of chaos, she focused on the image she would leave behind. She was preparing not only herself, but also how the memory of her presence might be carried out of the bunker by those who survived. This reframes Braun from the passive figure she was long assumed to be. Accounts of her last day show a woman setting the stage for her own ending. She had clothing arranged, possessions chosen for destruction, attendants instructed. She presented herself in a tailored dress, not a worn set of daily clothes. Far from trivial, these details mattered to her sense of identity. She would not step into memory as a frightened bystander. She would, at least in her own measure, choose the terms. Those who watched her at close range remembered the contrast. They recalled men around Hitler scribbling notes in confusion, drafting half-burned documents, contradicting one another in panic. Orders clashed and papers smoldered unfinished. Against that frenetic disorder, Braun stood out. Where their actions reflected disintegration, hers looked structured. Where their gestures betrayed collapse, hers suggested discipline. In this way, she even provided a kind of informal model to the women serving nearby, showing them how to carry themselves to the very end. Many of these memories persisted long after the war ended. Secretaries who testified decades later seemed still struck by the image she projected. They described the bunker rooms with detail, concrete walls, stains, smoke, and fumes, yet they always noted her calmness. That contrast made her presence feel staged, but it was also real. The calculated presentation aligned with her decisions about personal items and clothing. Taken together, these fragments point to purposeful preparation rather than unthinking compliance. Her choices carried into the way she met her death. Witnesses noted that she received cyanide, and discussions around its use were not hidden. People in the bunker spoke of it openly by the final day. Braun's decision to take it alongside Hitler was not sudden or forced, but accepted and prepared for in advance. Attendants did not describe a frantic final scene. They recalled instead a woman who had already made her peace, who had shaped her immediate environment, and who took steps to close her life in a way that fit her design. Viewed in this light, Eva Braun's routine in those final hours becomes less a question of devotion alone and more a statement of control. It was not about influencing events outside the walls, because those were irretrievable, but about influencing how she entered into memory. Down to the smallest gestures, she curated her own final frame. This perspective requires us to shift how we view the closing hours inside the bunker. Not only Hitler's collapse defined that space. Alongside him was a partner who acted deliberately, preparing her own end in carefully considered steps. She shaped her image with tidy authority, while others struggled to hold onto a collapsing order. Other members of Hitler's inner circle would later describe this period too, but from different viewpoints. Their recollections did not center on composure, but on what they witnessed as evidence was destroyed, identities erased, and memories shaped. One of those witnesses, who survived long after the others, offered testimony that gives an even more detailed account of what was removed and why. His words would open a clearer window into what these final preparations truly meant. The bodyguard who saw it all. Rochus Misch, Hitler's bodyguard and telephone operator, outlived almost everyone else who had been inside the Führerbunker during those last days. When he died in 2013, he left behind decades of interviews and public testimony that historians in the 2010s and 2020s revisited with fresh attention. Misch often repeated a consistent version when speaking to journalists, but scattered through his longer interviews and recorded conversations are small, practical details that matter far more today than ideological statements. He was not a policymaker or strategist. He stood in corridors, passed on messages, and manned the phones. That position was exactly what made him valuable. He noticed who carried what, when items were moved, and where tasks were carried out. It is this corridor-level record, unspectacular but precise, that gives his account its weight. In these accounts, Misch described what surrounded him in functional terms. He was in and out of offices, moving through the communication rooms, sometimes standing by doors where exchanges could be overheard. That gave him access to fragments of instruction, often mundane, but together they exposed how tightly the environment was controlled. By April 30th, the wider world above no longer mattered inside the bunker. Berlin was already overrun. Survival was not the question. What Misch saw instead was staff assigned to methodical tasks, designed to shape what traces would survive. He recalled hearing that not only were the bodies to be burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, but even textiles and furnishings touched by blood were singled out for destruction. Cushions, upholstery, and fabric, soaked in stains, were gathered separately and taken outside to the fires. These were jobs given to staff who should have been conserving strength, but were told instead to lift and transport ruined furniture through rubble-strewn exits. Misch did not describe it as ideology. He described it as labor he observed others performing because orders demanded it. It was the act itself that etched into his memory. Historians emphasize this distinction. Misch reported what happened, who carried objects, when items were destroyed, how the sequence unfolded. He did not speculate on why. The interpretation comes later, and it suggests these measures signaled not panic but calculation. Collecting fabric and insisting it be burned apart from bodies leans toward staging, toward removing even minor evidence that linked the dictator's end to human fragility. Misch made no claims of ritual or symbolism. He simply noted that cushions traveled the same path as corpses, and both ended in fire. Scholars connect those observations to a broader effort to control Hitler's image. The significance lies in what such details reveal about priorities in the midst of destruction. Ammunition was short, supplies scarce, and air almost unbreathable, yet orders still flowed about how a piece of furniture was to be handled. Misch remembered men bearing loads of fabric into the open, risking shellfire to place those remnants on flames already struggling with limited petrol. It is unlikely such precision was the product of chaos. The bodyguard's careful recollections pushed researchers to regard the last days as more orchestrated than older images of panic suggest. Misch's testimony also outlined the atmosphere among staff. He described exhaustion, irritability, and silence that hung over the rooms. No one appeared enthusiastic, but when these unusual tasks were ordered, they went ahead without protest. Misch believed this came less from loyalty and more from fear of deviating from orders even at this late stage. Those who worked the corridors did not debate meaning. They lifted objects, disposed of papers, carried fragments to burn. From his vantage point, the bunker emerges not as a place of random collapse, but as one where control was exerted down to the residue of blood on furniture. He recalled seeing papers shredded, clothing chosen for disposal, and small items removed with the same care as major documents. Misch's voice remained matter-of-fact. That is what made these statements useful. He did not coat them in dramatic language. He listed them like steps in a process. And for historians familiar with the gap between myth and verifiable action, such straightforward notes are telling. The image built from his words is not of Hitler commanding grand maneuvers, but of a leadership ensuring that even the smallest evidence of death and decay would not remain intact. The fires struggled to consume fully, but still every effort was made to feed them. If the petrol could not erase completely, then at least cloth and paper could be destroyed beyond recognition. Misch's repeated references to these tasks strengthened the interpretation that Hitler's death was framed deliberately, not left to chance. This has implications beyond the bunker itself. Testimony such as Misch's shows how information was managed internally, but outside forces would shape the narrative differently. The Soviets were the first major power to reach the sites of those fires. They did not just discover remains, they catalogued, argued, and concealed. What they found and how they chose to interpret it would dominate decades of speculation. The Bodyguard's recollections stop at the threshold of that discovery. He noted the tasks, the movements, the sequence of disposal, but he was not witness to the Soviet investigation that came after. For that, historians turn to sealed files and later releases that detail what investigators confronted when they entered Berlin. Misch provides the final view from inside. What follows is how the outside world received and concealed those fragments. It is at this point that the weight of disappearing evidence shifted from German hands into the hands of Soviet authorities, whose own secrecy added an entirely new layer to the mystery. Unmasking Soviet discoveries. In recent years, with new FSB releases and archival files made available in the mid-2020, researchers have uncovered Soviet documents and interrogation transcripts that reveal just how unsettled the Soviet leadership was in 1945 about what they had found in Berlin. These papers bring the internal hesitation into focus. They show that within days of recovering human remains from the garden of the Reich Chancellery, senior officers were corresponding in coded telegrams that reflected uncertainty, disagreement, and an unwillingness to announce that the body in their custody was without question Adolf Hitler. The telegram chains and interrogation notes recorded at the time help explain this caution. Field units reported that dental evidence had been retrieved, and dental staff who had worked for Hitler confirmed the unique patterns they recognized. The teeth were carefully separated from the rest of the remains, wrapped, and sent with urgency to verification teams. Commanders in Berlin relayed their findings with confidence, but the replies from Moscow were careful, almost deliberately non-committal. They asked for more reports, more tests, and more silence until senior officials gave approval. Rather than a decisive acknowledgement, what came back were requests for additional confirmation and repeated instructions to withhold public statements. The laboratory records from Berlin capture this process. Jaw fragments, skull pieces, and dental work were photographed, measured, and compared to earlier molds held in German files. Different sets of experts conducted examinations using chemical reagents, wax models, and microscopy. Each report logged methods and outcomes in detail, yet the phrasing remained cautious. Terms like consistent with or probable identity appear again and again. The science was strong enough to identify the remains, but the language stopped short of the certainty that would allow the leadership to release an official declaration. Archival evidence points to this restraint as political rather than scientific. Soviet doctors knew the evidence matched, but Stalin and those around him viewed the risk of error as catastrophic. If the regime announced Hitler's death and he later emerged elsewhere, their credibility would collapse. The documents suggest a culture in which suspicion overshadowed trust. Stalin feared being deceived, either by his enemies or even by his own military staff. At the highest levels, the response was contradictory. Confidence expressed privately met with orders for secrecy publicly. It was less about disbelief in the dental records than about political caution shaping how, or whether, the discovery would be shared. This secrecy had consequences. By locking away physical proof rather than showing it to their allies, the Soviets seeded doubt. Western intelligence soon noticed the inconsistency. Reports described Moscow privately asserting they had evidence, while in public Stalin hinted Hitler might have escaped. This contradiction encouraged speculation. Rumors circulated that the Soviets were hiding something more dramatic, perhaps even that Hitler lived on in another part of the world. Western services sometimes allowed such stories to spread. They underscored Soviet secrecy and deflected responsibility. The documents also reveal how thoroughly the Soviets managed their evidence. Orders were issued to store fragments under guard, to restrict access to only a few specialists, and to prevent discussion even with trusted Allied representatives. Over time, the fragments were hidden first in military archives, later in special KGB collections. Only a handful of officials saw them. Requests from Western governments in the late 1940s and 1950s to view the remains were flatly refused. This silence amplified suspicion. Without physical proof, even consistent eyewitness testimony from those inside the bunker struggled to carry full weight in the public mind. By the 1960s, when Cold War politics had hardened, the void created by Soviet secrecy was filling with invention. Books speculated about Hitler's escape, films imagined far-flung sightings, and television specials treated the survival myth as entertainment. The Soviets had achieved control of the evidence, but the price was the erosion of credibility. Secrecy became the soil in which conspiracies grew. The declassified files do not attempt to resolve the question of motive in a neat way, but they do show that caution at the top of the Soviet system explains the paradox. Stalin approached the problem with suspicion, instructing repeated testing and delaying acknowledgement. For him, political control outweighed scientific certainty. That choice shaped the narrative of Hitler's death for decades. The reports circulated internally describe a cycle. Commanders offered assurance, Moscow demanded more analysis, and official confirmation never came. Meanwhile, Stalin's briefings included comments reflecting distrust. He speculated his officers might unknowingly be fooled by German deception. This pattern had less to do with the science, which was straightforward, and more to do with the political climate of absolute control. Soviet leaders wanted to decide not only the facts, but also the timing and framing of those facts. As time passed, the evidence itself became a casualty of this secrecy. Locked away in Moscow, hidden from independent scientists, it turned into a symbol of mistrust. Even in later years, when the fragments were tested again and publicly identified, decades of concealment had conditioned people to see cover-up rather than clarity. Historians now emphasize that the Soviets created the very conditions that conspiracy theorists would later exploit. Had the evidence been shared openly in 1945 with British and American investigators, these myths may have struggled to take root. Instead, silence and secrecy ensured that counterfeit stories would endure. Today, researchers reviewing the interrogation transcripts and telegrams conclude that the Soviet Union's handling of the remains was less a scientific controversy than a political strategy. Stalin's insistence on control meant that certainty became impossible to broadcast. As a result, conspiracy theories that Hitler had escaped flourished in the gaps. Even though the material evidence consistently confirmed identity, the world outside never saw it. The files also underscore how decisions made in secret rooms became long-term historical forces. The Soviets intended to control the narrative, but the opposite occurred. By concealing what they had, they fueled decades of doubt, giving later popular culture and political rivals a ready source of speculation. These declassified documents close part of the record. They show how orders to silence and delay filtered from the top down, shaping what could and could not be said. But they also open another line of inquiry. While the Soviets built secrecy around the remains, others in Berlin were moving through hidden spaces without such control. Their actions, carried out beneath the city itself, added yet more layers to the story of those final hours. Escape routes beneath Berlin. Recent geophysical surveys and archaeological work in the 2010s and 2020s revealed collapsed substructures beneath central Berlin, shafts and conduits consistent with wartime accounts of multiple underground access points around the old Reich Chancellery. What appeared at first to be rubble-filled voids turned out, through radar imaging and mapping, to be interconnected passages. These were not simply sewers or drainage lines. They included utility corridors, reinforced service tunnels, and sections large enough for personnel movement. Their sheer scale, combined with records noting their wartime use, indicates that beneath the government quarter there was not a single sealed bunker, but a wider subterranean web. One feature documented by survey teams proved especially notable. Unlike ordinary drainage channels, this shaft linked toward underground railway junctions active in 1945. Its lining was more robust, its floor deliberately leveled for smoother movement. Archaeologists suggested it was designed as an auxiliary route, useful in emergencies when above-ground exits were blocked. The later discovery that Soviet units had deliberately collapsed and sealed several such corridors explains why they disappeared from view so quickly after the war. The filled material found in these blocked entrances matched demolition rubble dumped during the immediate post-surrender days, not natural erosion over time. It seems deliberate policy, not accident, removed much of this network from public notice. Post-war accounts rarely emphasized these structures, and there is little evidence they were meant as a broad escape system for Nazi leadership. Most passages originated as communication lines, civil defense shelters, or transport conduits, some connected to utility infrastructure, others to nearby bunkers. Still, their existence provided opportunity. Archival interrogation notes confirm that several German officers, pressed by collapse above, tried to flee using underground corridors. Soviet records describe capturing soldiers who surfaced from side shafts onto damaged rail lines. In other cases, fragmentary remains of uniforms and equipment recovered decades later indicate that some victims never reached daylight. The tunnels were unstable, often partially shattered by bombing, yet desperate men still entered them, leaving the traces rediscovered by modern surveys. For Hitler himself, the evidence strongly indicates these routes never represented a genuine option. He had already insisted that he would remain in the bunker and end his life there rather than be captured. His health was failing, he moved with difficulty, and the passages were treacherous even for the fit. More importantly, the accounts of those working closest to him described a man fixed on dying in Berlin, not one planning escape. The practical dangers of navigating partially collapsed tunnels under constant artillery would have made such an option inconsistent with his known choices in those final hours. Nonetheless, belief in subterranean exits helped fuel wider myths. By 1946, rumors spread in occupied Germany that Hitler had been seen alive abroad. These stories frequently rested on the claim that surface routes were sealed, but intact underground channels remained. Once civilians and officers alike had tried to flee that way, the possibility entered the public imagination. When tales of escape by sea or air then emerged, the logic always circled back to the underground. If others could reach rail lines below Berlin, perhaps Hitler too had disappeared down into those hidden spaces. The rediscovery of these shafts in modern surveys explained how such speculation first gained credibility, even though evidence never supported the idea that Hitler himself used them. The case of Martin Bormann illustrates both the desperate utility of these passages and the confusion they created. Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, attempted to flee on the night of May 1, 1945, moving through side corridors and out toward railway tracks near the Weidendammer Bridge. For decades, his fate remained uncertain, fueling every manner of rumor about escape abroad. It was not until 1998 that human remains found at a construction site in that area were identified through forensic testing as Bormann's. His death on the surface, near the very routes often imagined as leading to safety, underscored that escape from Berlin was almost impossible. The tunnel network allowed a few officers and civilians momentary concealment or progress, but not survival beyond Soviet lines. Excavation reports make clear how dangerous these passageways quickly became. Collapsed ceilings, fractured walls, water pooling in recesses, and blocked joints defined most of the recovered structures. Survey teams noted that even modern equipment struggled to penetrate these partially caved-in spaces. In 1945, with shelling above and rubble all around, their usability would have been limited to the reckless or desperate. Hitler, already weakened and attended by observers who documented his every move, could not have risked such a passage unnoticed. What remains instead is testimony that lesser officials, guards and stragglers gambled on those dark corridors and paid with their lives. From the Soviet perspective, these features represented a potential security breach. Records show that engineering units were ordered to seal tunnel mouths to prevent any organized escape. Their filling of exits was carried out systematically, producing the piles of mixed concrete, brick, and debris later found in blocked shafts. While the sealing of these conduits limited future investigation, it also aligned with the strict control exercised by Soviet command. They ensured that no story of Hitler's flight could be verified by retracing actual escape routes. In doing so, they also created the conditions for myth. Physical passages were hidden from view, so rumor quickly outpaced evidence. Each rediscovered substructure underscores the dual reality. Underground Berlin was a network of functional service and defense systems, not a singular escape highway. Yet in chaos, individuals tried to use it as such. The system could not deliver them to freedom. What it did deliver was the residue of attempts, human remains, uniforms, munitions, discarded equipment, trapped in collapsed shafts. These fragments, encountered long after the war, gave historians tangible proof of the desperation that gripped the final defenders and aides. For the broader public, they explained why theories of survival lingered long into the Cold War. In historical hindsight, these escape routes represent less a hidden opportunity for senior Nazis and more a record of collapse. They mark the final turning of a leadership cult into disorganized survival attempts. Hitler's refusal to step into them reflects his fatalism, while others who risked the passages reflect a different instinct, the need to try to live, however slim the odds. That divergence shaped both witness accounts and the enduring puzzle of Berlin's underground. The rediscovered evidence also reframes how we connect the physical environment of the capital with the stories told about Hitler's last days. Rumors of flight rested not on complete invention, but on partial truths. There really were subterranean paths, but the condition of those spaces makes clear they were routes into rubble more than ways out of defeat. By uncovering what still lies under Berlin's soil, archaeology does not support the escape myth. Instead, it highlights the extreme pressures felt by those willing to descend into them, and the futility that awaited once they did. In considering these passages now, the focus shifts away from fantasy about Hitler's departure toward clearer understanding of how the regime disintegrated under bombardment. In those same days, decisions made in the sealed air of the bunker, combined with the influence of men closest to Hitler, were having equal if not greater impact on his final commands. It is there, in the intersection of environment and medical intervention, that the next layer of the story emerges. The physicians around Hitler. Hitler was not isolated in those rooms beneath Berlin. Around him were physicians whose decisions shaped not only his body, but also the quality of his final hours. Archival medical records, testimony from witnesses, and modern forensic reanalyses show that in the last phase of 1944 and into 1945, he was heavily dependent on daily regimes of stimulants and sedatives. These included amphetamine injections, medications for digestion and eye strain, and barbiturates to blunt agitation. Specialists reviewing these patterns argue that such overlapping use of chemical opposites created cycles that matched the erratic behavior eyewitnesses later described in the bunker. Rather than balancing his health, the treatment seemed to push him between extremes. Witnesses recalled long spells of silence and heavy fatigue, followed by abrupt surges of energy and outbursts of paranoia. Experts note that stimulants like amphetamines can heighten suspicion and irritability, while sedatives can slow physical function and impair focus. Administered together, they tend to create rapid shifts rather than stability. The traces detected in forensic examinations, particularly cyanide residues found in dental material confirmed in studies from the 2010s, show how saturated his system was with substances even in death. The clinical picture is of a man caught in a feedback loop created by sustained medication rather than one experiencing only the natural decline of old age. By April 1945, those physical signals were plain. Secretaries, adjutants, and guards described his hands trembling, his steps uneven, and his reliance on furniture to move from place to place. His speech, once sharp, was reported to shift from mechanical detail to sudden venomous rants. Observers initially attributed this change to stress, age, or the strain of watching defeat unfold, but comparisons with known drug effects suggest a more complex picture. The overlap of chemicals kept in his bloodstream meant he was never free from their influence. Even moments that looked lucid carried the residue of stimulants or sedatives still working through his system. The most revealing example is his final dictated will on April 29. Line by line, it alternates between structured, detailed phrasing and bursts of rage aimed at supposed betrayers. Historians once treated this oscillation as ideological, reflecting both control and desperation. But psychiatrists who examined the document alongside drug histories argue it reflects neurological strain. They describe the pattern as consistent with stimulant elevation crashing into sedative dampening, a struggle inside the nervous system mirrored in the text itself. Accounts from secretaries reinforce this. They saw him spend stretches hunched over in silence, then suddenly rise and deliver monologues directed at no one in particular. Some of these episodes were written off as exhaustion or emotional collapse. Today, given medical evidence, they can also be read as expression of toxic overstimulation, crashes of focus followed by chemically driven bursts. Staff believed they were in the presence of calculation, but they may have been witnessing the body fighting through successive floods of chemical interference. Central to this was Theodor Maul, Hitler's personal physician, whose practices had been questioned even before the bunker period. Maul and others administered what can now be seen as reckless combinations of treatments. Letters, testimonies, and preserved dosage notes indicate a reliance on substances rarely prescribed in parallel for any other patient of the time. Amphetamines, barbiturates, hormonal preparations, and digestive aids were all recorded in regular use. Historians emphasize that Maul's position was contested among Nazi elites, with some disparaging his methods, others grateful for his ability to keep Hitler functioning. What unites those accounts is the recognition that Hitler was being sustained on aggressive chemical interventions at precisely the moment when judgment mattered most. This practice reflected a wider pattern in Nazi medicine. Doctors in the Reich were already implicated in programs of experimentation, euthanasia, and mass abuse. Applying unrestricted regimes to Hitler himself aligned with this mentality of pushing medical ethics aside for ideological or personal goals. The bunker, in its final days, became not only a shelter, but also a closed chamber where the highest political leader was effectively sustained as an experimental patient. Each injection reinforced dependence, and each dose drifted him further from natural states of mind. The implications for decision-making are profound. Orders for troop movements, directives to burn personal possessions, accusations against close staff, all occurred under the influence of these drug regimes. What appeared to be sudden strategic choices can also be interpreted as responses conditioned by pharmacology. The mistrust that flared against generals or aides may just as easily have been sharpened by chemical distortion. Without accounting for this layer, the image of rational calculation at the brink of collapse misrepresents what witnesses likely observed. Researchers stress that Hitler's state in those final days was not simply a product of ideology confronting defeat. It was also the result of years of escalating dependence on drugs administered by physicians who believed in chemical answers over restraint. The fortress walls might have given the impression of durability, but inside sat a man whose bloodstream reflected imbalance and compulsion. This framework helps explain why even his most basic interactions swung so unpredictably between sharp command and disorganized muttering. The testimony of his inner staff, secretaries, adjutants, guards, described their unease at these swings. They tried to justify them as the normal collapse of a man under siege. Yet modern re-evaluation shows they were watching a leader medically weakened and neurologically erratic. By the time final decisions were made in that chamber, the line between political desperation and chemical confusion had blurred entirely. His health was not only in decline, it was being aggressively steered by men who, consciously or not, helped erode his final grasp on clarity. This lens alters how history interprets the last commands of April 29-30. They were not clean conclusions delivered from a steady mind, but distorted statements emerging from a chemically saturated body. The frantic rehearsals of loyalty, the obsessive focus on betrayal, The repeated insistence on destruction of evidence all took place amid intoxication rather than sober calculation. To omit that factor is to miss the internal force shaping what seemed like outward control. Closing view of Hitler, then, is of a man held outwardly upright by medication, but inwardly collapsing under it. Far from demonstrating complete autonomy, his final decisions were inseparable from the treatments his doctors believed would sustain him. Their interventions did not preserve clarity, they accelerated decline. The reality of those last days was not a dictator commanding with unbroken certainty, but one whose mind and body were pushed about by the very hands meant to care for him. Against this backdrop, the atmosphere in the bunker became fragile in ways beyond the medical. Those closest to him were not just responding to defeat outside Berlin. They were reacting to a leader they could neither fully trust nor fully understand. That instability soon carried into the bonds among the circle itself, opening cracks between loyalty and survival. The last circle's fractures. By the final days of April 1945, distrust was not only gnawing at Hitler's mind, but eroding the ties among his immediate circle. Allies who had once seemed immovable pillars of devotion were now repositioning themselves in full view of the collapsing Reich. Göring's transgression over succession and Himmler's secret overtures to the West are well documented and were the triggers for Hitler's fury in late April. The confirmation of these betrayals sent shockwaves through the bunker. Radio reports and staff whispers turned the confined concrete corridors into chambers of suspicion, where each conversation seemed bound to circle back to disloyalty. Soviet interrogation files, only recently re-examined, show that by April 29 and 30, many of those confined with Hitler had already begun planning their own escape. What emerges from these testimonies is not the picture of collective sacrifice the regime later tried to portray, but individuals quietly sketching alternate futures. Officers copied maps onto scraps, adjutants tucked away preserved rations, and even clerical workers rehearsed routes through shattered streets. These were not displays of doctrinal devotion, but acts of calculation. Staff sought paths to survival while still sitting only rooms away from the dictator who demanded they pledge to die beside him. This contrast cut sharply against Nazi propaganda of the time, which imagined the bunker as unified and willing to perish in loyalty. The reality, described in those testimonies, was fractured. Secretaries who had followed Hitler through years of service were accused of cowardice for hesitating over documents. Guards were warned that any pause at their post might be construed as betrayal. Even when staff were simply exhausted and slowed by smoke-filled air, Hitler treated fatigue as conspiracy. What had begun as a war against external enemies now felt to those inside like a war of accusation directed at themselves. Archival records emphasize that the mix of pressures was overwhelming. Military disaster confirmed by radio, news of betrayal from Göring and Himmler, and Hitler's failing health all combined to intensify an already claustrophobic world. Survivor memoirs add another pattern: heavy drinking among officers and aides who could not face the imminent end. For some, denial and intoxication blurred reality more effectively than ideology. Bottles circulated in hidden corners, laughter broke out where days earlier there had been tension, and silence returned once the Führer entered the room. These coping patterns, alcohol, escapism, detachment, appear again and again in post-war testimony. The strain surfaced in subtle signals rather than open rebellion. Soviet interrogators recorded stories of cooks delaying meals, hoping food might stretch further, guards preparing excuses to abandon their stations the moment Soviet troops appeared, secretaries admitting that they longed not for devotion, but for a chance to slip through damaged tunnels into the burning city above. Such stories challenge the myth of unity. They reveal a community that was slowly unraveling under the weight of fear. For Hitler, however, the betrayals of Göring and Himmler carried more weight than the flight of an adjutant or the hesitation of a guard. Those two names represented the top of his hierarchy. Göring's attempt to declare himself Führer and Himmler's discreet approach to Western negotiators symbolized the collapse of the inner structure he had imagined unbreakable. Eyewitnesses recalled his fury. outbursts not just against his generals in Bavaria or commanders elsewhere, but against the secretaries within reach who became proxies for disappointment. Each shout, each accusation underscored the sense that loyalty, even in his immediate circle, was corroding. Even those closest to Hitler shifted between loyalty and calculation. Goebbels remained outwardly defiant, committed to a shared fate for him and his family. Bormann, though still ever present, kept a keen eye on possible routes of survival. Interrogations from adjutants suggest that arguments broke out in whispered tones along the bunker corridors, debates about whether staying meant certain death, and whether there was even the slimmest chance of breaking through to the north or west. No longer bound by the illusion of unity, each man and woman occupied a private sphere of judgment. Some fought to maintain the appearance of solidarity, others traced out secret exit routes in their minds. Stripped of speeches, the reality was familiar human instinct. Beneath the ideology, fear of death overshadowed devotion. Aides thought of children and families beyond the bunker, though unreachable. Secretaries rehearsed the paths they might follow if they escaped unseen. Soldiers calculated which direction led toward captivity by the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. It was all conducted under the risk of discovery. Hitler's suspicion was intense and his punishments swift, yet the instinct for survival proved stronger than oath or uniform. By April 30, Hitler's perception of betrayal had widened until it encompassed almost everyone around him. Notes kept from that time show his handwriting crowding the margins, repeating words like weak and coward. They were not directed only at distant commanders, but also at the very faces sharing his table. The collapse of external armies mattered less to him than the collapse of loyalty within arm's reach. The man who demanded absolute sacrifice had chosen death for himself, but denied others even the possibility of imagining life beyond him. These fractures mattered because they exposed the truth behind the slogans. For years, Nazi propaganda claimed unity unto death, but the testimonies and records from those days prove that unity did not survive contact with reality. Devotion gave way to exhaustion. Speeches of loyalty were replaced by hidden maps and concealed rations. Whispered plans to slip away stood alongside blaring accusations of treachery in Hitler's hallways. The scaffolding of trust that had sustained his rule had now disintegrated, replaced by suspicion and secrecy. The image of the last circle is not one of a group marching together to an inevitable fate. It is of individuals improvising, doubting, fearing, and sometimes betraying one another. The end of the Third Reich was not only military defeat, but the dissolution of the inner circle that had held its leader in power. What they became in those final days, fractured, fearful, and driven by survival, defines the closing chapter of Hitler's world. And within this fractured circle, the fixation on betrayal and death set the stage for Hitler's own final act. When the moment arrived, the question was not whether he would die, but how he would ensure that death carried the certainty he wanted. It is here that the physical evidence, jaw fragments, skull pieces, and the chemical traces preserved in them, provides answers that eyewitness testimony alone could not. Minute of death, what science shows. Science has provided the closest look at the end of Hitler's life by examining the fragments left behind. Minute traces preserved in bone and teeth make it possible to reconstruct what happened in the bunker as his inner circle waited just outside the room. This is the moment historians describe as the minute of death, and forensic evidence remains the most reliable tool for piecing it together. In 2017-2018, forensic specialists were granted access to jaw fragments long kept in Moscow's archives. The dentition, consistent with Hitler's dental records, showed clear chemical residues. Analyses detected cyanide compounds embedded in the porous material of the teeth and surrounding bone. That finding reinforced eyewitness testimony that he had bitten a capsule, carrying poison into his bloodstream almost instantly. The fact that cyanide traces were present in preserved dental remains confirmed this detail beyond oral recollection. At the same time, another set of remains kept in Moscow, a skull fragment with a visible entry wound, continued to stir debate. For years, its origin was contested. Some researchers argued it belonged to Hitler, citing fracture patterns consistent with a gunshot at close range. Others maintained it was misattributed. Re-examinations over the past 2 decades, however, have strengthened the case that this fragment may indeed be linked to him. The internal stress lines and radiating fractures resemble those seen in a cranial gunshot rather than collapse or post-war damage. While not accepted by every scholar, enough specialists now view it as evidence of a shot delivered at near contact range. Taken together, these 2 lines of forensic evidence, dental samples saturated with cyanide and cranial bone displaying gunshot trauma, point toward a combined method of death. Modern historians increasingly accept that both poison and bullet were used, not as competing theories, but as simultaneous facts. The contradictions that once fueled decades of argument can now be reconciled. Hitler most likely swallowed poison while also pulling the trigger. For the wider public, the notion of choosing both methods can seem redundant. Why poison and pistol together? Yet, in the context of Hitler's psychology, the redundancy makes sense. In his final conversations, he spoke of Mussolini's body being desecrated in Milan, a fate he swore to avoid. His paranoia extended not only to his generals and staff, but even to the mechanisms of death itself. A cyanide capsule might fail, a pistol might misfire. In his eyes, only doubling the certainty eliminated the slightest possibility of survival. Eyewitness testimony, divided for decades, lines up more clearly under this interpretation. Secretaries and adjutants in nearby rooms recalled hearing what might have been a muffled gunshot, while others maintained they heard only silence until the door opened. For many years, such inconsistencies undermined confidence in their accounts. But a sequence where both poison and gunfire occurred resolves how both experiences were possible. The sound of a single shot, softened by concrete walls, could have been missed by some, while the overpowering effect of poison ensured he was beyond recovery almost immediately. The urgency with which attendants entered and removed the bodies also fits this revised picture. If poison alone had been the cause, the delay before death might have been longer, leading to hesitation before entering. With a gun fired in a closed space, smoke and blood would have been apparent, demanding quick removal of the corpse. Eyewitnesses described the bodies carried out wrapped in blankets, brought swiftly to the garden above. Haste aligns with evidence of a gunshot more than it does with cyanide alone. What emerges is not only a clinical reconstruction, but a window into his state of mind. For years, scholars debated whether his suicide was driven by fear, control, or ideology. The dual method suggests all 3. Fear of humiliation compelled him to act decisively. Control dictated that he leave nothing to chance. Ideology underpinned the theatricality of orchestrating his death as the final gesture of defiance. Death was to be on his terms alone, secured by 2 instruments acting together. The forensic debate has also reshaped how eyewitness behavior is read. Accounts of staff being reluctant to enter or hesitating only an instant before rushing in make sense if the scene inside combined the chemical stench of cyanide with the physical trauma left by a bullet. One does not exclude the other. Together, they create a moment many initially struggled to interpret, but which science has rendered coherent. These findings also explain why conspiracy theories endured for decades. For a long time, skeptics pointed to contradictions. If there was cyanide, why did some hear a shot? If a shot was real, why was poison found? Such disputes became fertile ground for speculation that Hitler escaped or staged his death. The updated interpretation that he used both methods closes this gap. What once seemed illogical now slots into place. He ensured redundancy because his greatest fear was the failure of certainty itself. It is important to note that not all scholars frame the evidence as conclusive closure. Some remain cautious about the skull fragment, noting the long history of disputed attribution. The explanation that cyanide was undeniable while the gunshot remains probable reflects the balanced conclusions of many expert panels. Even if not accepted as final certainty, the convergence gives historians the closest scenario, yet to resolving the question of that day. The significance lies less in whether science can prove the cause to the last detail than in how the results illuminate his mindset. The dictator who once demanded careful planning in everything extended that planning to the exact second of his own end. Redundancy was not unnecessary. It was the expression of his compulsion for control. No accident, no malfunction, not even the chaos outside would define the outcome. He would. From the fragments of bone and the traces of chemicals, science has brought together evidence that narrows a debate spanning generations. Cyanide residue in the teeth, fracture lines pointing to a pistol shot, two kinds of death, one man determined to leave nothing undone. In their combination, the final act of Hitler's life appears less a mystery than a demonstration of extreme certainty, a deliberate doubling to destroy uncertainty itself. Yet the story of that moment does not end with how he died. What followed carried equal weight in shaping his legacy. As attendants removed his body from the bunker, they began another process, an attempt to erase the evidence that any of it had ever taken place. Erasing evidence, the controlled burn. Archival photographs and film, published at intervals since the war, show the Reich Chancellery garden in the days after Berlin fell. The images are stark: charred earth, broken masonry, blackened patches of soil, and scorched fragments mixed into the rubble. Far from the claim that Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies were annihilated without trace, the evidence reveals that the burnings were incomplete. Personal items, jewelry, metallic fragments, and pieces of bone remained visible, contradicting the narrative of a perfect cremation. Survivor testimony adds to this picture, describing desperate measures that never matched the intent of total eradication. Eyewitness accounts stressed how the process unfolded in stages. After Hitler's death, attendants carried the bodies up into the open garden, but the ground there was cratered with shell holes, soaked through with rain, and scattered with debris. Petrol was poured over the corpses to ignite the first flames, yet supplies were already almost gone. Flames sputtered weakly and died down within minutes, producing smoke, but leaving the corpses only partly consumed. What followed was a grim cycle. Fires rekindled with scraps of fuel, rags and uniforms stripped and thrown on top, wooden furniture smashed for kindling. Each attempt burned away sections, but left recognizable parts behind: feet, joints, and skull fragments protruding through ash. Witnesses later confirmed that this start-stop pattern was not one spectacular blaze, but several small, frantic efforts. The Soviet and Western reports issued soon after the city's fall confirmed these details. Both noted multiple rounds of ignition, each hindered by the damp soil and lack of fuel. The contradictions in timing and in how many attempts were made lingered in testimony and in records, giving later conspiracy theories space to grow. For some, the very fact that fragments remained visible suggested the pyre might have been staged. For others, that the bodies could have been spirited away instead. In truth, all the evidence points to improvisation and scarcity. Even with the will to destroy, the materials available in late April 1945 could achieve only an uneven, partial cremation. Photographs taken by Soviet units capture this better than any written record. Soldiers documented scorched bones mixed with clinker and soil hardened by melted fuel. They sketched outlines of fragments and boxed what could be recovered. Among these lay items of Eva Braun's jewelry, easily recognizable and unaffected by the flames. These discoveries undercut Nazi claims that nothing remained after cremation. The propaganda insisted on an absolute erasure. The evidence demonstrated failure. The environment made the task all the harder. Rain had soaked the garden, blast craters filled with water, and broken masonry disrupted the movement of air. Fires were repeatedly smothered by shifting winds and dust. Petrol, the only accelerant, splashed ineffectively in shallow puddles. Even smashed chairs and doors carried up from inside fueled only brief flare-ups. Witnesses described half-burned remains lying beside charred wood, an image later investigators confirmed. The process never generated the sustained heat needed for full cremation. Instead, it left an uneven scene of smoldering debris and lingering human fragments. German accounts released later told a different story, emphasizing precision and totality. the Führer's body eliminated so no enemy might ever display it. But this curated version could not survive comparisons with Soviet documents, and the visible remains photographed in the garden. Forensic assistants recorded themselves digging through ash and retrieving recognizable shapes. One report noted bones fused with melted cloth, awkwardly pried out with tools. Far from showing mastery over evidence, such images displayed the limits of what collapsing resources could achieve. What strikes historians is the symbolism involved. In those hours, attendants spent Berlin's last drops of petrol not in battle, nor in escape, but on corpses lying exposed in a garden. Each return trip with rags, cloth, and bits of timber was performed under artillery fire and with Soviet forces minutes away. They could not preserve the city nor their leaders' collapsing empire, but they still attempted to shape its ending in fire. The act was less practical than theatrical, a display to deny the enemy possession of the body, even if it meant sacrificing their last reserves. For decades, loyalists insisted this theater worked. They spoke of a leader consumed entirely by flame, erased so that no one could defile him as Mussolini had been defiled in Milan. Yet the evidence left behind, bones, fragments, jewelry, undermined that pride. The Soviets saw at once that not everything had disappeared. Stalin himself recognized the implications. If remnants persisted, then the story of a flawless, planned cremation looked fragile. Secrecy thus grew not from success, but from visible failure. The bodies had not been obliterated, they were only badly scarred. By viewing the archival films and photographs today, a sharper reality comes into focus. The frames show scorched earth and men crouched with sticks prodding debris. Small metallic glints stand out in the rubble, items never touched by flame. The spectacle imagined in propaganda, an orchestrated pyre, efficient and absolute, collapses against this record of hasty improvisation. What happened in the garden was not a decisive ritual, but a clumsy, fragmentary act carried out by exhausted attendants who no longer had resources or time. The significance of this failure goes beyond technical details of destruction. It influenced what followed. Soviet leadership, presented with surviving remains, understood at once that German assurances of erasure were hollow. This knowledge fueled both secrecy and doubt. Where Hitler had sought certainty, contradiction took root instead, and those contradictions left open a space that rumor and conspiracy later filled. Looking back across testimony, reports, and images, the picture solidifies. A poorly supplied, stop-start series of burnings carried out in wet soil, with fragments left behind and personal objects scattered among ash. No total annihilation, only traces that stood as evidence of how the regime ended, in haste, in failure, and in contradiction. Those fragments were not only physical remains, they also became psychological markers for those still inside the bunker. The fires above did not just consume fuel, they signaled finality for the community trapped below. As their leader's body smoldered imperfectly in the garden, the people left underground faced their own fates, each deciding whether to follow him in death or attempt a desperate escape. The fate of Hitler's inner circle. When Hitler ended his life on April 30th, those who remained inside the bunker faced their own endings in rapid succession. Newly translated Soviet files, aligned with testimony gathered at the time, outline how differently each member of the inner circle confronted those last hours. There was no single pattern. Some turned to suicide without hesitation, others made desperate escape attempts through the ruins of Berlin, and a few were captured alive. The myth that the surviving circle followed Hitler in one collective act collapses, as each fate is set side by side. Joseph Goebbels provides the clearest case of ritualized destruction. He cast himself as Hitler's final disciple, refusing to abandon his family or retreat from Berlin. What Soviet files and later West German investigations confirm is that on May 1st, his 6 children, ranging from 4 to 12 years old, were murdered with poison in their beds. Forensic autopsies conducted on their recovered bodies found cyanide as the cause of death, and multiple witness accounts tie Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger to the act, suggesting he equipped Magda Goebbels with tablets and injections to ensure compliance. These details grim as they are, make clear that the killing was deliberate and methodical. Soon after, Joseph and Magda walked outside into the garden where Hitler's body had already been partly burned. Both broke cyanide capsules between their teeth while guards carried out a perfunctory attempt to burn their corpses. Their remains were left half-charred near the same crater. The Goebbels family's decision embodied loyalty in its most catastrophic form, propaganda taken to the destruction of their children and themselves. In sharp contrast, Martin Bormann tried for survival. Hitler's party secretary slipped out during the night of May 1st with maps in hand, leading a small group toward the Weidendammer Bridge. He carried documents and plotted a course through shell-scarred streets, aiming to cross over into zones not yet fully seized by Soviet control. For decades, his disappearance fueled rumors that he had escaped to South America or lived under false names. But in 1972, skeletal remains were unearthed near a construction site by that very bridge. And in 1998, forensic testing confirmed through DNA that they belonged to Bormann. His end was not exotic. It was quick and local. He collapsed and died close to where he had attempted to break out. The evidence revealed that his flight was planned along a known escape corridor, but that the effort fell apart in the open streets. Other high-ranking figures made their choices inside the bunker itself. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, one of the officers present as Hitler dictated his last will, took poison when faced with defeat. Alongside him, General Hans Krebs, the chief of the General Staff, ended his life the same way. Krebs had tried to negotiate surrender terms with the Soviets, but when he was met with nothing but demands for unconditional capitulation, return to the bunker sealed his fate. Their deaths were discovered later by Soviet search teams who documented the bodies in their rooms. Neither man fled. Both saw suicide as the only controlled option left. Some figures attempted movement outward, but fell quickly into enemy hands. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet who had stood at his side through the final days, and Otto Gunsch, the adjutant who supervised the burning of Hitler's corpse, both tried to escape. They were captured and interrogated by Soviet units. Their accounts became crucial pieces of evidence in early Soviet reports, with Gunsch confirming details of the cremation sequence. Their survival ensured that information from inside the Führerbunker carried into post-war documentation, though much of it was tightly held in Soviet custody for decades. Rochus Misch, the bodyguard and telephone operator whose memories carried far into the post-war era, also walked out alive. Captured by Soviet forces, he spent nearly a decade in prisoner camps before eventual release. He lived until 2013, the last eyewitness who had stood inside those corridors. While most of his interviews repeated a practiced version of events, the sheer longevity of his life connected the modern public to the environment of April 1945. His endurance highlights how survival itself could outlast loyalty, turning a minor security officer into one of the most enduring witnesses. When these threads are placed together, the story of the inner circle becomes a study in fracture rather than unity. Joseph and Magda Goebbels carried through a fanatical act that eliminated their children and themselves, believing their deaths would seal loyalty to Hitler. Martin Bormann threw himself into the rubble trying to escape, proof that survival instinct had eclipsed ideological devotion. Burgdorf and Krebs accepted suicide as preferable to Soviet capture, products of both loyalty and despair. Gunsch, Linge, and Misch survived by extension, caught alive and turned into subjects of Soviet scrutiny. The bunker, pictured for years as a tomb around its leader, is revealed by these accounts as a place of divergence. Some walked upstairs into suicide, others turned down into tunnels seeking escape. Still others retreated into their rooms in silence. The setting was unified by walls of concrete, but the psychology inside had split along irreconcilable lines. Each decision reflected fear, calculation, or compulsion. Each departure wrote a different ending to the same collapse. The choices carve out a spectrum that reshapes how defeat is understood at the personal level. For Goebbels, defeat was a signal to enact ideological sacrifice, extending destruction even to his own children. For Bormann, defeat was a call to attempt survival at any cost, even if it proved futile. For officers like Krebs and Burgdorf, defeat left only a narrow road of suicide once negotiation failed. For attendants such as Gunch, Lynch, and Misch, it became a matter of enduring whatever came, even Soviet interrogation and long captivity. These endings, viewed side by side, expose how the bonds of loyalty did not hold in uniform fashion. The system that had demanded absolute unity produced only scattered and uneven choices under pressure. What Soviet archives and forensic confirmation have given historians is not a romanticized tableau, but a fragmented mosaic of outcomes. Children poisoned in beds, bodies burned half-heartedly in the garden, escapes that collapsed within blocks, captures that ended in interrogations and years of imprisonment. The contrast is stark, and it underlines how far reality had departed from propaganda. The sacralized image of Nazis dying together in a demonstration of absolute loyalty never existed. Instead, it dissolved into improvisation, fear, and disparate fates. This variety also matters for what came after. Fragmented endings left space for rumor. Bormann's disappearance became a canvas for speculation. Survivors, testimonies, filtered through decades of secrecy and Soviet control of evidence, fed contradictory interpretations. Those gaps in certainty later offered fertile ground for myths surrounding Hitler himself. If his closest men could vanish, survive, or alter their stories, then for many it seemed possible to imagine that he too might have escaped. And it is precisely in those shadows of uncertainty, left behind by the fractured exits of his inner circle, that the next chapter begins. The weight of conspiracy in 2025. Stories about Hitler's supposed escape continued to grow long after the war ended, and despite the breadth of physical and documentary evidence proving otherwise, they remain present today. In 2025, polls and surveys over decades still indicate that a minority in several countries believes Hitler survived Berlin and fled overseas, most often to South America. That minority is smaller than before, but it is persistent enough to shape discussion. Its survival is not the result of missing information. It lingers because conspiracy thrives even when knowledge is abundant, and because secrecy and delay allowed space for the myth to take root. The first seeds were sown immediately in 1945. The Soviets recovered remains in Berlin but concealed their findings, locking away skull fragments and dental evidence in military archives. By withholding details, they created precisely the vacuum that rumors thrive upon. Without access to proof, stories expanded. Hitler had boarded a last submarine, had flown secretly to Spain, or vanished into colonies in Argentina. By the 1950s, pulp novels and newspaper features were already painting scenes of a dictator alive in faraway jungles. These accounts did not rely on new evidence. They flourished because the Soviet command insisted on silence. Rumors were compounded by the bureaucratic routines of intelligence services. In the 1960s and 70s, declassified Western files recorded dozens of alleged Hitler sightings. Intelligence officers noted them not because they believed them, but because discarding reports ran against practice. Once they were typed and filed, they seemed official. When later accessed by the public, conspiracy writers claimed these records proved government's suspected survival. In reality, the files said less about plausibility than about how intelligence work accumulates unverifiable tips. But for audiences primed to distrust authority, the existence of the documents felt like confirmation rather than the routine cataloguing of rumor. What the accumulated evidence shows today is straightforward. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30, 1945. Jaw fragments tested in forensic laboratories match precisely to his dental records, and cyanide residues confirm poison ingestion. A skull fragment consistent with gunshot trauma adds further weight, aligning with eyewitnesses who testified that staff carried his corpse upstairs. Soviet photographs and official records support the sequence. Archaeological investigations under Berlin mapped tunnels used by fleeing officials, but none show Hitler among them. Still, each new discovery, no matter how precise, has never silenced the louder story told by myths of survival. One reason is cultural appetite. Myths rewrite a mundane ending into something dramatic. For conspiracy writers and entertainers, Hitler's death in a bunker was too small an ending for such a colossal figure. Escape into the southern hemisphere provided spectacle. Secret submarines, compounds in Argentina, clandestine Nazi societies nestled in jungles. When adapted into films or broadcast documentaries, these stories offered imagery of adventure that the real account could not supply. Audiences consumed them willingly, and the repetition blurred lines between narrative entertainment and what some assumed was history. Equally important is the psychology of proportion. The scale of Hitler's crimes seems to demand a suitably large finale. A dictator responsible for millions of deaths collapsing into paranoia and poison in a sealed room appears disproportionate to his historical weight. To many, the final scene feels too ordinary for a man who once dominated continents. Myths of escape balance that dissonance, suggesting that a monstrous legacy required a grand, mysterious ending. Yet it is precisely in the plain details, cyanide, pistol, and failed cremations, that the reality stands. His private collapse, surrounded by suspicion and decay, is more accurate than fantasies of fleeing submarines. Surveys and reports into 2025 show how these myths adapt rather than fade. The scale of belief has declined, but in regions where social media recycles false claims, a noticeable minority continues to insist Hitler escaped. Their stories rely on fabricated photographs and forged diaries, circulated in forums and repeated in online videos. Some variations merge Hitler's supposed survival with other conspiracies, pairing him with legends of secret Antarctic bases or lost Nazi technologies. These hybrid myths show less interest in history than in weaving folklore out of fragments of uncertainty. The gap between evidence and imagination is striking. Scientists provide dental reconstructions, microscopic scans of bone, and chemical analyses measured to fractions of a milligram. Governments release telegrams, orders, and testimony that mirror one another across opposing archives. Archaeologists uncover blocked tunnels and sealed conduits consistent with escape attempts by others, but not by Hitler. In contrast, conspiracies recycle anonymous claims and falsified images, repeating them until they appear credible. Certainty is built piece by piece through scientific process, but belief thrives on repetition and narrative appeal. Much of the myth's endurance can still be traced back to the information gap created in 1945. Soviet leaders declined to release evidence, limited scholarship, and guarded dental fragments as classified material for decades. Western governments, receiving only fragments, offered contradictory comments in public statements. The secrecy looked like concealment. Into that silence myths poured. By the time files began to open gradually, conspiracy culture had already layered books, films, and claims across popular memory. Once those alternate narratives were seeded, later records could not easily displace them. Historians emphasize that in examining these myths, one learns less about Hitler's death than about the societies that recycle the idea of his escape. Accepting his suicide means facing the truth that the supposed architect of a 1,000-year Reich ended frail, drug-dependent, and fearful in a bunker polluted by fumes and suspicion. To imagine him instead slipping into a submarine or stepping onto South American soil allows for denial. It replaces weakness with intrigue. For some, that is more bearable. The myth comforts by creating a story grand enough to seem fitting, when in reality, the truth reduced a tyrant to squalor. For a military-minded audience, there is also a tactical lesson. Misinformation thrives where command systems operate in secrecy. The Soviet choice to guard their evidence and delay transparency created space where rumor could survive unchallenged for decades. In military terms, this became a strategic miscalculation. By concealing for control, they instead seeded distrust that persists into the present. The persistence of the Hitler escape myth is less about the dictator than about information discipline. The more opaque the system, the more resilient the misinformation it produces. Seen in this light, the survival conspiracy becomes not a mystery, but a study in how denial works. The historical record is fixed. Hitler died in Berlin on April 30, 1945. His remains partially burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden. But conspiracies form when secrecy overlaps with cultural appetite for spectacle. They endure because myth promises an ending large enough to match catastrophe, while truth offers only claustrophobic finality. For 2025, the lesson is simple. In the absence of openness, myth thrives. And as those myths continue to echo, what remains most important is not the fantasy of escape, but the clarity of evidence. That clarity matters because it prevents history from being rewritten into spectacle. It holds firm the record of what happened, even against voices that insist otherwise. And it is against that backdrop of fact and denial that we turn to the final view of Hitler's last days. Taken together, the archival releases, eyewitness testimony, forensic re-examinations, and excavations produce a picture of a man physically and mentally compromised, trapped in poisoned air, medicated into instability, and surrounded by subordinates already charting their exit. The bunker appears less a fortress of command than a collapsing shell where cohesion broke apart room by room. What endures from those hours is not an escape legend but a warning. When command structures disintegrate, secrecy and denial magnify the collapse. For a military audience, this underscores the cost of fractured leadership and controlled information. Which single new detail surprised you most? The failing air, the doctor's drugs, or the tunnel finds? Share your thoughts below.